Senator Bennet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Faulkender, thank you for being here, and thanks for our meeting, I think, earlier this week. I know the deficit is a concern of yours, as it is of mine. Can you tell us when the last time this government had a surplus was?
If memory serves, I think it was right around the turn of the millennium.
Do you know who was president when we last had a surplus?
My recollection is that it was Bill Clinton.
It was President Clinton. Do you recall what percentage of GDP we were collecting as revenue versus what we were spending as a government?
Those particular years, I believe we were in the 18 to 19%
I would
range.
agree with that. And just to make it easy for people, if there is anybody out there online, your relatives watching it, just to make it easy, those revenue and costs lined up as a percentage of our overall economy, and that meant that we had a surplus. And we haven't had a surplus since. Would you agree that that's true?
Yes, we have not had a surplus since 2001.
Would you agree that every year during the last Trump administration, this is an unusual situation because we almost never have a president who was president, then there's an interruption, and then a president comes back, that the last year there was a Trump administration that every year the deficit of the United States went up?
My recollection is that we ran deficits each of those years. I don't remember if they grew every year.
They grew every year. I appreciate your candor. And that was after people sat in that chair, just like you, and said that they were going to enact what they called pro-growth tax policy, or tax reform, I think is how you put it, pro-growth tax reform, which I think is code for cutting taxes for the wealthiest people in the country, because if you look at the distribution tables, that's what it is. But pro-growth tax policy, and the argument was, always is, that it would pay for itself. Do you agree that that was the argument that you made, that your administration made when Donald Trump was president the last time?
Senator, if you look at the revenue numbers that have come in, they exceed the forecast.
Do you agree that the argument was that it would pay for itself the last time that you and the others were here?
My recollection is that some people made the argument that it would pay for itself.
Certainly the Treasury Secretary did, and we heard that again from Mr. Besant when he was here. We actually heard him say that he was going to solve this problem, Mr. Chairman, when he was here, by cutting discretionary spending, that he was going to deal with what is now a deficit that is 6% of our GDP by cutting discretionary spending. We heard the president say the other night that he was never going to touch Medicare. He was never going to touch Medicaid, that he was going to ram his tax cuts through for everybody, he said, in America. America should know, though, by the way, that the last time he did this, 55% of the benefit went to the top 5% of Americans, that it turned out that the Congressional Budget Office was correct when it said that it would blow a $2 trillion hole in our deficit. So in my mind, it's no different than, and I've said this before here, I won't belabor it, it's no different than any mayor of any city in America saying we're going to go out and borrow more money than we've ever borrowed before in the history of my town. And I would say, well, that makes me nervous. What are you going to spend that on, Mayor of Grand Junction or Mayor of Lyman or Mayor of Denver? These are red and blue parts of my state. Are you going to spend that money on schools? No. Or on mental health? No. On parks or public spaces? No. On affordability? No. What are you going to spend it on? We're going to give it to the 2 richest neighborhoods in the community and hope that it will trickle down to everybody else. There's a reason why no mayor in America has ever done that, ever in our country. And the reason is they can't lie about the deficit because they have to balance their budgets. And now we're in a situation where we've got a 6%, we're at a deficit that's now at 6%. And the biggest contributor to that has been the tax cuts that were supposed to pay for themselves. Do you think there's any way to meaningfully reduce our deficit by cutting just discretionary spending in our budget?
Senator, when Secretary Besson talks about getting the deficit down to 3% of GDP, it's by implementation of the president's full economic plan. Part of that is spending reductions, part of that is growth, part of that is tariff policy, part of that is deregulating the economy, part of that is unleashing American energy abundance. It's the cumulative activity of all of those things that Secretary Besson has argued that would realize the reduction.
I would just say, we'll be back here and we'll have a conversation about it. I would say in this case, it's a very unusual case when the sum of those parts that you just described are actually going to add up to something much less than itself, which is blowing a massive new hole in the deficit, just as it did the last time your predecessor sat here and made exactly the same argument. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for the time.
Thank you.